A frightened little girl whispers one word to a police officer on a quiet suburban street. That single word, basement, ignites a chain reaction, uncovering a hidden network of unimaginable horror. As the officer scrambles to piece together the truth, what he finds behind that locked door will leave you speechless and change the lives of countless children forever. The streets of Brookhaven were unusually quiet that evening, with only the hum of streetlights and the faint chirping of crickets filling the air. Officer Lincoln Jace had been patrolling this small suburban town for years, and while it wasn't known for much action, he'd learned never to let his guard down. Tonight, though, felt different. A heaviness lingered in the air that he couldn't quite shake. As Lincoln turned his patrol car onto Elm Street, his headlights illuminated a figure sitting alone on the curb. He slowed the car, squinting to get a better look. It was a child, a little girl, no older than 8 or 9. She was hunched over, hugging her knees tightly to her chest, her curly hair tied into 2 puffs that framed her tear-streaked face. The oversized yellow jacket she wore seemed to swallow her tiny frame, making her look even smaller in the dim glow of the streetlights. Lincoln pulled the car to the side of the road and radioed in. "Dispatch, this is Officer Jace. I've got a young girl alone on Elm Street. I'm going to check it out." "Copy that, Officer Jace," came the response. "Proceed with caution." Lincoln exited the car, adjusting his flashlight as he approached her slowly. His movements were measured, his hands visible, his voice calm and gentle. He'd worked with children before and knew how easily fear could escalate in situations like this. "Hey there," he said softly, kneeling a few feet away from her. "Are you okay? What are you doing out here all by yourself?" The girl didn't respond. She didn't even look up at him, her eyes fixed on the pavement as her small fingers clutched the sleeves of her jacket. Her trembling shoulders and the way she kept glancing nervously down the street told Lincoln everything he needed to know. She was scared. Really scared. "What's your name?" he tried again, keeping his tone warm and non-threatening. "I'm Lincoln. I'm a police officer, and I'm here to help." This time, she lifted her head just slightly, her wide, tear-filled eyes locking onto his for a fleeting moment. Her lips trembled as she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Lincoln's heart tightened. "It's okay," he said gently. "You don't have to be scared. You're safe now. Can you tell me what's wrong?" The girl hesitated, her small chest rising and falling as she took shallow breaths. Finally, she leaned forward slightly, her voice barely audible. Lincoln leaned in closer, careful not to invade her space. When she spoke, it was just one word. One single word, but it sent a chill down Lincoln's spine. "Basement." Lincoln froze for a moment, his mind racing. He'd been trained to recognize the signs of trauma, and the way she said that word, with a mix of fear and desperation, made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Basement," he repeated softly. "What about the basement? Is someone down there?" The girl nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Her small hands gripped the edges of her jacket as if trying to hold herself together. "Okay," Lincoln said, keeping his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. "I need you to stay right here, okay? Don't move. You're safe now." He stood up and reached for his radio, his tone shifting from calm to urgent. "Dispatch, this is Officer Jace. I need immediate backup on Elm Street. We may have a critical situation. Lock down the area." "Copy that, Officer Jace," the dispatcher replied. "Backup is on the way." Lincoln turned back to the girl, who was now staring at him with a mix of fear and hope. He crouched back down, meeting her at eye level. "I'm going to stay with you, okay? Can you tell me your name?" "Amara," she whispered. "Amara," he repeated with a reassuring nod. "You did the right thing by telling me. I'm going to make sure everything is okay. I promise." She didn't respond, but the slightest hint of relief flickered in her tear-streaked face. Lincoln could see how hard it had been for her to speak, how much courage it had taken to even whisper that one word. Whatever was happening, he knew it was serious, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. The faint sound of sirens in the distance signaled the arrival of backup. Lincoln stood and turned toward the approaching vehicles, his mind racing. He didn't know exactly what they were walking into, but one thing was certain: Amara's whisper had just changed everything. The flashing red and blue lights of the arriving patrol cars painted Elm Street in an eerie, flickering glow. Officers stepped out of their vehicles, hands on their holsters, ready for anything. Lincoln stood near his patrol car, his mind replaying Amara's whispered word over and over: basement. It carried a weight that Lincoln couldn't ignore, and he could feel in his gut that this was more than just a scared child running away from home. Amara remained in the back seat of his patrol car, her small frame barely visible through the window. She hadn't said anything else, but her eyes darted nervously toward the house at the far end of the street. It was a two-story structure with a neatly trimmed lawn, warm porch lights, and flower boxes under the windows. From the outside, it looked completely ordinary. But Lincoln knew better than to trust appearances. His partner, Officer Riley Maddox, approached him, her face tight with concern. "What do we know so far?" she asked. "Not much," Lincoln admitted. "Her name is Amara, and she mentioned something about a basement. She's scared out of her mind, Riley. Whatever's going on, it's bad." Riley glanced toward the house Amara had been eyeing. "You think it's that one?" Lincoln nodded grimly. "She hasn't said it outright, but her body language says enough." As they spoke, Detective Mark Ridley, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving the toughest cases, arrived on the scene. He approached Lincoln and Riley, his expression sharp and serious. "Jace, Maddox," Ridley greeted them. "What are we dealing with here?" Lincoln quickly brought him up to speed, detailing Amara's condition and the single word she had whispered. Ridley frowned, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the house. "We'll need a warrant before we can enter," Ridley said. "But we can cordon off the area and start gathering intel. If the girl's as scared as you say, we can't take any chances." Lincoln nodded. "Understood." While Ridley coordinated with dispatch to expedite the warrant, Lincoln returned to the patrol car where Amara was sitting. She looked up at him as he opened the door, her eyes still filled with fear. "Amara," he said softly, crouching to her level. "I need your help. Can you tell me if someone is in that house? Someone who might be in trouble?" She hesitated, her small hands fidgeting with the edges of her jacket. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," Lincoln said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Is it just one person, or more?" "More," she whispered. Lincoln felt a chill run down his spine. "Are they kids, like you?" Another small nod. "Amara, you're doing so good," he said, trying to mask the urgency in his tone. "Can you tell me if you were in that basement too?" Her lip quivered, and she nodded again, a single tear sliding down her cheek. Lincoln's chest tightened. This wasn't just a scared child, this was a survivor. Whatever she had endured, she had found the strength to escape and warn them. He wasn't going to let her bravery go to waste. With the warrant in progress, officers began canvassing the neighborhood. Most residents were confused by the sudden police presence, but one elderly woman stepped forward, her face pale and worried. "I don't want to make trouble," she said, wringing her hands, "but I've noticed some strange things about that house." Lincoln and Riley listened intently as the woman continued. "I've seen a black van coming and going at odd hours, sometimes late at night. And I've heard noises. Crying. I thought maybe I was imagining it, but now I'm not so sure." "Thank you, ma'am," Lincoln said, exchanging a glance with Riley. "That's helpful." The description of the van matched what Lincoln had feared, a possible vehicle used for trafficking. He relayed the information to Ridley, who immediately issued an alert for any matching vehicles in the area. As night fell, the tension grew. The warrant was finally secured, and a SWAT team was called in to assist. Officers surrounded the house, their movements swift and silent. Lincoln stayed with Amara, not wanting to leave her alone, but his heart raced as he watched the team prepare to enter. The command came quickly. Go. The front door was breached, and the SWAT team swept inside. Lincoln watched from a distance, every muscle in his body tense. Minutes felt like hours as he waited for word from inside the house. Then, over the radio, a voice crackled. "We've found the basement. Multiple rooms. Signs of confinement." Lincoln's stomach churned. He turned to Amara, who was watching intently from the back seat. "Amara," he said, his voice steady but soft, "I need you to stay here, okay? You're safe, I promise." She nodded, but her small hands were shaking as she gripped the seatbelt across her chest. Inside the house, the officers descended into the basement. The air was cold and heavy, the walls lined with thick concrete. At the far end of the basement, they found a locked metal door. It took a battering ram to break it open, and when they did, what they found left even the most experienced officers stunned. The room beyond the door was small and dark, with makeshift cages along the walls. Inside were signs of recent use, discarded children's clothing, empty water bottles, and tattered blankets. Though the cages were empty, it was clear this was no ordinary basement. This was a holding area. Detective Ridley called out orders. "Get forensics down here now. Search the entire house for clues. I want to know where these kids were taken." As officers worked to process the scene, Lincoln stood outside the house, his fists clenched. Amara had led them to something horrific, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Where were the children? And who was behind all of this? Lincoln looked back at Amara, who sat quietly in his patrol car, her wide eyes fixed on the house. She had been brave enough to whisper the truth. Now, it was up to him to make sure it wasn't too late. The basement door swung open, revealing a scene that sent shivers down the spines of even the most seasoned officers. The room was cold and damp, illuminated by a single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. Against the far wall were rows of small, makeshift cages, each constructed of rusted metal bars. Discarded scraps of fabric lay scattered across the floor, blankets, perhaps, or clothing that had been ripped apart. The faint smell of mildew mixed with something far more sinister hung in the air. Detective Mark Ridley was the first to step inside, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. He scanned the space, his jaw tightening as he took in the details. "This isn't just a basement," he muttered to the officers behind him. "It's a holding cell." Lincoln stood at the top of the basement stairs, his heart pounding as he listened to the reports coming through his radio. Amara's whispered word, "basement," had led them here, and now it was clear that her fears had been justified. He glanced back toward his patrol car, where Amara sat watching from a distance, her wide eyes fixed on the house. She knew what they would find, even if she couldn't put it into words. Inside the basement, Ridley motioned for a forensic team to start processing the scene. One officer crouched by a cage, holding up a small shoe, a child's sneaker, barely worn. "We've got evidence," he called out. "Belongings left behind." Another officer pointed to the walls, where faint scratch marks were visible on the concrete. "Looks like someone was trying to claw their way out," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Ridley's radio crackled as an officer upstairs called in. "Detective, we found documents in a locked drawer in the living room. Looks like records. Names, dates. Bring them down," Ridley ordered. He turned back to the cages, his mind racing. This wasn't just a case of child endangerment, it was something far darker. The pieces were starting to come together, but they painted a horrifying picture. Outside, Lincoln paced near the patrol car, his mind whirling with questions. Amara had been in that basement, but she'd escaped. How? And why was she the only one? He needed answers, but he knew pushing her too hard could backfire. He opened the car door and crouched down to her level. Amara, he said gently, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. You're so brave for helping us. What we found in that house, it's going to help a lot of kids. But I need your help to understand what happened. Can you tell me more about the basement? Amara didn't look at him right away. She stared down at her lap, her small hands fidgeting with the zipper of her oversized jacket. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. They put us in there. Me and the others. Lincoln's stomach tightened. The others? How many were there? Amara hesitated, counting on her fingers as if trying to recall. 4. Maybe 5. I don't remember. Lincoln nodded, keeping his expression calm even as his heart raced. Okay. And were they all kids, like you? She nodded. They were scared. We all were. Did you ever see the people who put you in the basement? He asked gently. Amara's face darkened, her body tensing. They wore masks, she said. I couldn't see their faces. But there was a man, he talked to us sometimes. He said no one would find us. Lincoln's fists clenched at her words, but he kept his tone steady. Amara, how did you get out? How did you escape? Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at him. The door wasn't locked one night. I ran. I didn't stop running. Lincoln felt a lump in his throat. He reached out, placing a reassuring hand on the edge of the car door. You did the right thing, Amara. You got away, and you told us. Because of you, we can help those other kids. Amara nodded, but her tears continued to fall. Lincoln wanted to tell her everything would be okay, but he knew it was too soon for promises. The children she spoke of were still missing, and every second that passed felt like a second too long. Inside the house, Ridley examined the documents the officers had found. They were crude but damning, handwritten lists of names, some with ages scribbled next to them. Most of the names had been crossed out, but a few at the bottom of the list remained untouched. Amara Bellamy, Ridley read aloud. Her name was circled, with a question mark next to it. His stomach churned as he flipped through the pages. This is a ledger, he muttered. They were tracking them. An officer entered the basement, holding up a phone in a plastic evidence bag. Found this hidden in a drawer upstairs. It's encrypted, but if we can crack it, we might find more. Ridley nodded, his mind racing. Good. Get it to the tech team ASAP. Every piece of information we can get is critical. As night deepened, the search of the house continued, but the children Amara had spoken of were nowhere to be found. Lincoln stood near the police barricade, his jaw clenched as he watched officers come and go. Amara had escaped, but what about the others? Had they been moved? Were they still alive? Riley approached him, her expression grim. There's no sign of the kids, she said. But we've got enough evidence to confirm this was a trafficking operation. The question is, where did they take them? Lincoln nodded, his eyes dark with determination. We'll find them, he said. We have to. Riley placed a hand on his shoulder. We will. Amara gave us a starting point. Now it's up to us to finish this. As the forensic team loaded evidence into their vehicles and officers began clearing the scene, Lincoln returned to Amara. She was curled up in the back seat, her small body trembling under the weight of everything she'd experienced. We're going to find them, Lincoln said softly, his voice filled with conviction. I promise, Amara. We'll bring them home. Amara didn't respond, but the faintest flicker of hope crossed her face. It was enough to keep Lincoln going. Detective Mark Ridley sat in the dimly lit precinct office, the documents retrieved from the house spread across the table in front of him. The names and ages scribbled on the lists painted a chilling picture. Each crossed-out name likely meant a child who had been moved, their fate unknown. At the bottom of the list were 5 names that hadn't been crossed out. Amara Bellamy's was among them, circled in red with a question mark beside it. Ridley tapped his pen against the table, his mind racing. They were tracking their victims, he muttered to himself. But why leave her name circled? She escaped. Were they planning to come after her? His thoughts were interrupted by Officer Riley Maddox, who walked into the room holding an evidence bag. Inside was the phone they had found at the house. "Tech team cracked it," Riley said, dropping the bag onto the table. "It's bad, Ridley. There are messages, location logs, and even photos. They were coordinating movements for the kids." Ridley's stomach churned as he flipped through the printed copies of the data. The text messages were concise but chilling in their implications. "Pickup complete. Moving them tonight. ETA warehouse, 2 a.m. Van ready." His fingers stopped on one message in particular. It was dated the previous night, 5 ready for transport. Warehouse secured. Ridley slammed the papers down and grabbed his radio. "Get Lincoln and Maddox in here," he barked. "We've got a location." Meanwhile, Lincoln sat with Amara in the break room at the precinct. She was curled up on the couch, sipping hot cocoa from a paper cup. The warm drink had calmed her slightly, but her eyes still darted nervously around the room. Lincoln sat across from her, his tone gentle as he spoke. "Amara, you've helped us so much already," he said. "But we think we might know where the other kids were taken." "A warehouse. Does that sound familiar?" Amara froze, her small hands tightening around the cup. "Warehouse," she whispered. "That's where they said they'd take us if we didn't listen." Lincoln leaned forward slightly, his heart aching at the fear in her voice. "You're so brave, Amara. Do you remember anything else about the warehouse? What it looked like? Where it might be?" She hesitated, then nodded. "It was big. Gray. And there were trains. I heard them at night." Lincoln's mind raced. "Trains," he repeated. "Riley, did you catch that?" Riley, who had just entered the room, nodded. "There's a freight yard about 10 miles from the house. A warehouse backs right up to it." "That's got to be it," Lincoln said, standing abruptly. He turned to Amara, crouching to her level. "Amara, you've done something incredible tonight. You've helped us get closer to finding those kids. Now I need you to stay here, where it's safe, okay? We're going to get them back." She didn't speak, but she nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. Within an hour, a full team was assembled. SWAT officers, detectives, and local police gathered for the briefing. Ridley stood at the front of the room, pointing to a map projected onto the wall. "This is our target," he said, gesturing to the warehouse near the freight yard. "Based on the evidence retrieved from the phone, this is where they're holding the children. We've got confirmation from a reliable source," he paused, glancing at Lincoln, "that they may still be there." The room was tense, the weight of the operation hanging heavy over everyone present. Ridley continued, "Our primary objective is the safe recovery of the children. Secondary objective, apprehend any suspects on site. We move in quietly, no unnecessary risks." Lincoln and Riley exchanged a look. They'd been partners for years, but tonight felt different. This wasn't just another case. This was a fight to save innocent lives. The team arrived at the warehouse just before midnight. The freight yard was eerily quiet, the distant sound of trains rumbling in the background. Officers moved in silently, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The warehouse loomed large and gray against the night sky, its windows boarded up and its metal walls streaked with rust. Lincoln and Riley led the entry team, their weapons drawn as they approached the side entrance. The door was locked, but a crowbar quickly solved that problem. They entered cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the concrete floor. Inside, the air was thick and stale. The first floor was empty, rows of old machinery and rusted shelves. But as they moved deeper into the building, they found a staircase leading down to the basement. Lincoln's heart pounded as he descended, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, they found another locked door. Ridley signaled to the SWAT team, who used a battering ram to break it open. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears. The room was dimly lit, lined with small, makeshift cages similar to the ones in the house. Inside, 5 children sat huddled together, their faces pale and tear-streaked. The youngest couldn't have been older than 5. "Clear the room," Ridley barked. Officers moved swiftly, cutting through the locks on the cages and wrapping the children in blankets. Lincoln knelt beside one boy, his voice gentle as he reassured him. "You're safe now," he said. "We've got you." The children were quickly escorted out of the building and loaded into waiting ambulances. As Lincoln carried one of the youngest out, he couldn't help but think of Amara. Her bravery had led them here, had saved these lives. Detective Mark Ridley sat in the dimly lit precinct office, the documents retrieved from the house spread across the table in front of him. The names and ages scribbled on the lists painted a chilling picture. Each crossed-out name likely meant a child who had been moved, their fate unknown. At the bottom of the list were 5 names that hadn't been crossed out. Amara Bellamy's was among them, circled in red with a question mark beside it. Ridley tapped his pen against the table, his mind racing. They were tracking their victims, he muttered to himself. But why leave her name circled? She escaped. Were they planning to come after her? His thoughts were interrupted by Officer Riley Maddox, who walked into the room holding an evidence bag. Inside was the phone they had found at the house. "Tech team cracked it," Riley said, dropping the bag onto the table. "It's bad, Ridley. There are messages, location logs, and even photos. They were coordinating movements for the kids." Ridley's stomach churned as he flipped through the printed copies of the data. The text messages were concise but chilling in their implications. "Pickup complete. Moving them tonight. ETA warehouse, 2 a.m. Van ready." His fingers stopped on one message in particular. It was dated the previous night, 5 ready for transport. Warehouse secured. Ridley slammed the papers down and grabbed his radio. "Get Lincoln and Maddox in here," he barked. "We've got a location." Meanwhile, Lincoln sat with Amara in the break room at the precinct. She was curled up on the couch, sipping hot cocoa from a paper cup. The warm drink had calmed her slightly, but her eyes still darted nervously around the room. Lincoln sat across from her, his tone gentle as he spoke. "Amara, you've helped us so much already," he said. "But we think we might know where the other kids were taken." "A warehouse. Does that sound familiar?" Amara froze, her small hands tightening around the cup. "Warehouse," she whispered. "That's where they said they'd take us if we didn't listen." Lincoln leaned forward slightly, his heart aching at the fear in her voice. "You're so brave, Amara. Do you remember anything else about the warehouse? What it looked like? Where it might be?" She hesitated, then nodded. "It was big. Gray. And, there were trains. I heard them at night." Lincoln's mind raced. "Trains," he repeated. "Riley, did you catch that?" Riley, who had just entered the room, nodded. "There's a freight yard about 10 miles from the house. A warehouse backs right up to it." "That's got to be it," Lincoln said, standing abruptly. He turned to Amara, crouching to her level. "Amara, you've done something incredible tonight. You've helped us get closer to finding those kids. Now I need you to stay here, where it's safe, okay? We're going to get them back." She didn't speak, but she nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. Within an hour, a full team was assembled. SWAT officers, detectives, and local police gathered for the briefing. Ridley stood at the front of the room, pointing to a map projected onto the wall. "This is our target," he said, gesturing to the warehouse near the freight yard. "Based on the evidence retrieved from the phone, this is where they're holding the children. We've got confirmation from a reliable source," he paused, glancing at Lincoln, "that they may still be there." The room was tense, the weight of the operation hanging heavy over everyone present. Ridley continued, "Our primary objective is the safe recovery of the children. Secondary objective, apprehend any suspects on site. We move in quietly, no unnecessary risks." Lincoln and Riley exchanged a look. They'd been partners for years, but tonight felt different. This wasn't just another case. This was a fight to save innocent lives. The team arrived at the warehouse just before midnight. The freight yard was eerily quiet, the distant sound of trains rumbling in the background. Officers moved in silently, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The warehouse loomed large and gray against the night sky, its windows boarded up and its metal walls streaked with rust. Lincoln and Riley led the entry team, their weapons drawn as they approached the side entrance. The door was locked, but a crowbar quickly solved that problem. They entered cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the concrete floor. Inside, the air was thick and stale. The first floor was empty, rows of old machinery and rusted shelves. But as they moved deeper into the building, they found a staircase leading down to the basement. Lincoln's heart pounded as he descended, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, they found another locked door. Ridley signaled to the SWAT team, who used a battering ram to break it open. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears. The room was dimly lit, lined with small, makeshift cages similar to the ones in the house. Inside, 5 children sat huddled together, their faces pale and tear-streaked. The youngest couldn't have been older than 5. "Clear the room," Ridley barked. Officers moved swiftly, cutting through the locks on the cages and wrapping the children in blankets. Lincoln knelt beside one boy, his voice gentle as he reassured him. "You're safe now," he said. "We've got you." The children were quickly escorted out of the building and loaded into waiting ambulances. As Lincoln carried one of the youngest out, he couldn't help but think of Amara. Her bravery had led them here, had saved these lives. Back at the precinct, Amara was waiting in the break room when Lincoln returned. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with anticipation. He crouched beside her, a tired but genuine smile on his face. "We found them," he said softly. "All of them. They're safe." Amara's lip trembled, and tears spilled down her cheeks. For the first time that night, she smiled, a small, fragile smile, but a smile nonetheless. Lincoln gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "You did that, Amara. You saved them." She didn't respond, but the relief in her expression said everything. The warehouse raid had been a success, but the night was far from over. As officers secured the scene and collected evidence, Detective Mark Ridley coordinated the transport of the rescued children to the local hospital. Each child was examined by doctors and nurses, who worked tirelessly to ensure they were physically stable and tended to their immediate needs. The youngest, a little boy named Leo who could barely speak through his tears, clung tightly to Lincoln as he was carried into the ER. "You're okay now, buddy," Lincoln said softly, feeling the child's small arms wrapped tightly around his neck. "Nobody's going to hurt you again." Leo's sobs quieted slightly, but his grip didn't loosen. Lincoln stayed with him until a nurse gently pried the boy from his arms, promising to take good care of him. Lincoln nodded, his jaw tightening as he stepped back. Every fiber of his being wanted to stay, but there was more work to be done. Meanwhile, Ridley returned to the precinct with the rest of the team, including Riley, to begin piecing together the larger picture. The phone retrieved from the house had provided key evidence, but now it was time to make sense of it all. Riley sat at a desk, scrolling through the messages and GPS data as Ridley pored over the handwritten ledger found in the house. "This wasn't just one house or one warehouse," Riley muttered, her brow furrowing as she read through the data. They've been moving kids across state lines. This is part of a network. Ridley rubbed his temples, his exhaustion evident. That's what I was afraid of, he said grimly. The documents mention other locations, safe houses, transfer points. We're just scratching the surface here. Lincoln walked into the room, his expression just as grim. How many kids are still out there? He asked, his voice low. Riley hesitated. Based on what we've found so far, at least a dozen. Maybe more. Lincoln felt a knot tighten in his chest. And the people running this? Do we have anything solid on them? Ridley nodded, tapping a photo taped to the whiteboard in the center of the room. This guy. Thomas Greaves. He's listed as the owner of the warehouse and has a history of involvement in shady businesses. He's our main suspect. And do we know where he is now? Lincoln pressed. Not yet, Ridley admitted. But we've got his phone records and financial transactions. We're tracking him. Back at the precinct's break room, Amara sat quietly, her knees pulled to her chest as she watched officers come and go. Despite the warmth of the room, she shivered, her small frame still overwhelmed by everything she'd endured. Lincoln walked in, his steps slowing as he saw her. He grabbed a cup of hot cocoa from the counter and sat down across from her. Hey, Amara, he said gently, sliding the cup toward her. How are you holding up? She shrugged, her eyes fixed on the table. Are the kids okay? She asked after a long pause. They're safe, Lincoln said, his voice soft but firm. Because of you. You're the reason we found them. Amara looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with uncertainty. What if they come back? She whispered. What if they find me? Lincoln leaned forward, his expression serious but reassuring. They're not going to find you, he said. We've got officers watching over you, and we're going to make sure the people who did this can't hurt anyone else ever again. Amara nodded slightly, but her fear didn't fully fade. Lincoln could see the weight she carried, fear, guilt, and the lingering trauma of what she'd experienced. He wanted to promise her that everything would be okay, but he knew it would take time for her to feel truly safe again. Hours later, Ridley called Lincoln and Riley back into the briefing room. We've got a hit on Greaves, he announced, pointing to a red dot on the map pinned to the wall. His last known location was a private airstrip on the outskirts of the county. He's trying to run. Lincoln straightened, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Do we have enough to bring him in? More than enough, Ridley said, his voice grim. Let's move. The team mobilized quickly, assembling a task force to intercept Greaves before he could leave the area. The airstrip was located in a remote part of the county, surrounded by dense woods and accessible by only a single road. As Lincoln and Riley drove toward the location, the tension in the car was palpable. This guy's the key, Riley said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. If we can take him down, we can start unraveling the entire operation. Lincoln nodded, his gaze focused on the road ahead. We're not letting him get away. When they arrived at the airstrip, the team moved into position, surrounding the hangar where Greaves was last seen. The hum of a small plane engine could be heard in the distance, and Lincoln's heart raced as he realized the suspect was preparing to take off. Go, go, go. Ridley barked through the radio. Officers stormed the hangar, weapons drawn. Greaves, a wiry man with sharp features and cold eyes, was halfway up the steps to the plane when he froze, his hands raised in surrender. Don't move. Lincoln shouted, his voice echoing through the hangar. Greaves turned slowly, a smirk playing on his lips. You don't know what you're getting into, he sneered. Save it, Riley snapped, moving to cuff him. You're done. As Greaves was led away, Lincoln felt a surge of relief. This was a victory, but he knew it was only the beginning. The operation was bigger than one man, and the fight to dismantle it entirely was far from over. Still, as he watched the plane engine sputter and die, he allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. The children they'd saved were safe. And the man who had hurt them was finally in custody. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. The precinct was alive with activity the morning after Thomas Greaves' arrest. Officers and detectives worked tirelessly to connect the dots, combing through the documents, phone logs, and financial transactions recovered from the warehouse and Greaves' personal belongings. The air was thick with determination. Everyone knew they were standing on the edge of something massive, a chance to dismantle an entire trafficking network. Detective Mark Ridley stood at the center of the operations room, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a stack of evidence in the other. He gestured to the whiteboard, which was now covered with photos, maps, and notes. A thick red line connected Greaves to several key locations: the house, the warehouse, and a series of properties registered under shell companies. These properties, Ridley suspected, were being used as safe houses to hold children before they were moved. "Listen up," Ridley said, his voice cutting through the noise. The room quieted as officers turned their attention to him. Greaves isn't just a middleman. He's a major player in this operation. His records indicate connections to at least 3 other states and a network of accomplices who've been trafficking kids for years. Lincoln Jace stood near the back of the room, his arms crossed. The thought of Greaves and his accomplices moving children across state lines made his blood boil. He glanced at Riley Maddox, who was reviewing a list of properties flagged as potential safe houses. "Any leads on where the other kids might be?" Lincoln asked. Riley nodded, holding up a sheet of paper. "One of the flagged properties is an abandoned motel on the edge of town. It's remote, near the highway, perfect for quick transfers." Ridley pointed to the map. "Then that's our next move. Jace, Maddox, you're leading the team. Get over there and see what you can find. If it's active, we need to shut it down immediately." Lincoln and Riley exchanged a glance, then nodded. "We're on it," Lincoln said. As they drove to the abandoned motel, Lincoln couldn't shake the image of the children they'd already rescued. Their tear-streaked faces, their trembling hands, it was a reminder of what was at stake. He thought of Amara, her quiet bravery, and the weight she carried despite her young age. She'd already done so much to help, and now it was up to him to finish the job. The motel came into view as they turned off the highway onto a narrow, gravel road. It was a dilapidated structure, with faded paint peeling off the walls and broken windows covered with sheets of plywood. The parking lot was overgrown with weeds, and a rusted sign hung crookedly from a pole, the words, "Red Pine Motel," barely visible. Riley parked the car a safe distance away, and they approached the building on foot, their weapons drawn. A SWAT team followed close behind, moving silently to surround the property. Lincoln pressed his back against the wall near the entrance, peering through a crack in the plywood covering one of the windows. Inside, he could see faint movement, shadows flickering against the dim light of a single bulb. His stomach clenched. Someone was definitely inside. He gave the signal, and the SWAT team breached the front door. The sound of splintering wood and shouted commands filled the air as officers stormed the building. Lincoln and Riley moved quickly through the narrow hallways, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Clear," one officer called from the first room. "Clear," another shouted from the second. But as they reached the back of the motel, they found a locked door. Riley signaled to the team, and a battering ram was brought forward. The door gave way with a loud crash, revealing a hidden room. Inside, they found 3 children huddled together on a dirty mattress. They looked terrified, their wide eyes darting to the officers as they entered. Lincoln immediately holstered his weapon and crouched down, his voice soft and steady. "It's okay," he said. "You're safe now. We're here to help." One of the children, a boy no older than 6, clung to the others, his small body trembling. Riley knelt beside Lincoln, holding out a blanket. "Let's get you out of here," she said gently. As the children were escorted out of the motel and into waiting ambulances, Lincoln noticed something on the floor, a map, partially crumpled but still legible. He picked it up and examined it closely. Several locations were marked with red XS, including the motel and the warehouse they had raided the night before. "Ridley needs to see this," Lincoln said, handing it to Riley. "It could lead us to the other properties." Back at the precinct, the map became the centerpiece of their investigation. Ridley spread it out on the table, marking each location on the larger map pinned to the wall. "This isn't just a list of properties," Ridley said. "It's a roadmap. They've been moving kids between these locations, using them as temporary holding points before shipping them out." Riley tapped one of the marked locations. "This one's in another state. If we're going to hit it, we'll need to coordinate with local law enforcement." Ridley nodded. "Do it. And cross-reference this map with the phone data we recovered. If Greaves was in contact with anyone at these locations, we need to know." Lincoln leaned against the wall, his arms crossed as he watched the team work. The operation was massive, and the scale of what they were uncovering was staggering. But for the first time since the investigation began, he felt a glimmer of hope. They were closing in on the network, and with every piece of evidence they uncovered, they were one step closer to shutting it down. Later that evening, Lincoln visited Amara in the safe house where she'd been staying. She was sitting at a small table, coloring quietly, but she looked up and smiled faintly when she saw him. "Hi, Officer Lincoln," she said softly. "Hi, Amara," he replied, sitting across from her. "I wanted to tell you something. We found more kids tonight. They're safe now, just like you." Amara's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really," Lincoln said with a nod. "And it's all because of you. You were brave enough to speak up, and you helped us find them." Amara looked down at her drawing, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper. "Will they be okay?" she asked. "They will," Lincoln said firmly. "And so will you." Amara gave him a small smile, and for the first time, Lincoln saw a spark of hope in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The arrests were piling up. Over the next several days, coordinated raids on the locations marked on the map uncovered more evidence and, most importantly, rescued additional children. Each new operation revealed another layer of the network, as detectives pieced together the connections between Greaves and his accomplices. The scope of the trafficking ring was more extensive than anyone had anticipated, but with every lead they followed, they came closer to dismantling it completely. Detective Mark Ridley sat in the precinct's operations room, a growing stack of files spread across his desk. He was exhausted but determined. "We've got 7 properties cleared," he said during a briefing. 13 kids rescued so far, and 4 suspects in custody. But there are still gaps. This isn't the entire operation. Greaves was working with someone bigger. Lincoln Jace leaned against the wall, arms crossed, listening intently. He had spent the past several nights alternating between coordinating operations and checking on Amara, who had become a quiet but vital presence in the investigation. It was her courage that had cracked this case wide open, and Lincoln felt a deep sense of responsibility to ensure her bravery wasn't in vain. "Any new leads on Greaves' associates?" Lincoln asked, his voice low but sharp. Riley Maddox, seated next to Ridley, nodded as she sifted through a pile of documents. "We've been going through the phone logs and financial records. There's one name that keeps coming up, Victor Hensley. He's listed as a business partner on several shell companies tied to the properties. We think he's the one coordinating the bigger picture." Ridley tapped the board where Hensley's photo was pinned. "This guy's dangerous. Former military, dishonorably discharged. He's been off the grid for years, but it looks like he resurfaced to run this operation." Lincoln's jaw tightened. "Do we know where he is?" "Not yet," Ridley admitted. "But we've traced a large wire transfer from one of the shell companies to a private property upstate. It's isolated, heavily secured. If he's anywhere, it's there. Riley added, the problem is, we don't have enough to get a warrant. The property is technically registered as a hunting lodge, and there's no direct evidence tying it to the trafficking operation. Lincoln frowned. So what do we do? Wait for him to move again? Ridley shook his head. No. We surveil the property. If we see any sign of activity, we move in. Later that evening, Lincoln stopped by the safe house to check on Amara. She was sitting at the dining table with her younger brother, Micah, who had been rescued during the warehouse raid. The two of them were drawing on sheets of paper, their faces calm but still marked by the lingering shadows of fear. Hey, Amara, Lincoln said as he entered. How's it going? She looked up and gave him a small smile. Okay, she said. Micah's been drawing animals. He's really good. Micah held up his paper, showing a crayon sketch of a bright orange tiger. Lincoln smiled. That's awesome, Micah. You've got some serious talent. Micah's face lit up at the compliment, and he went back to his drawing. Lincoln turned his attention to Amara, lowering his voice slightly. How about you? How are you holding up? Amara shrugged, her small hands fidgeting with the edge of her paper. It's better now. Micah's here, and we're safe. But I still think about the other kids. The ones we didn't find. Lincoln crouched down to her level, his voice steady. We're doing everything we can to find them. You've already helped us so much, Amara. Because of you, we've rescued 13 kids. That's 13 lives you've saved. Amara nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I just want them to be okay. They will be, Lincoln said firmly. And so will you. The following morning, Ridley received a call from the surveillance team stationed near the property tied to Victor Hensley. The lead agent's voice was tense. We've got movement. 2 vehicles just pulled in, black SUVs. One of them matches the description from the earlier raids. Ridley immediately called for a full task force. This is it, he told Lincoln and Riley as they geared up. We've got one shot at taking Hensley down. If he's there, we need to bring him in alive. He's the key to dismantling the entire operation. The team moved swiftly, assembling at a staging area a few miles from the property. Lincoln double-checked his gear, his mind racing with thoughts of the children still unaccounted for. Every second mattered, and he was determined not to let Hensley slip through their fingers. As they approached the property under the cover of darkness, the tension was palpable. The lodge was surrounded by dense woods, with high fences and security cameras monitoring the perimeter. The task force split into teams, each assigned to breach a different entry point. Lincoln and Riley led the main entry team, their footsteps silent as they approached the front gate. Using bolt cutters, they created an opening and slipped inside, their weapons drawn. The air was cold and still, broken only by the faint hum of generators from the lodge. Ridley's voice crackled softly through the radio. Position secure. On my mark, 3, 2, 1. Go. The teams moved in simultaneously, breaching doors and sweeping through the building. Lincoln's adrenaline surged as he cleared room after room, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The lodge was larger than expected, with multiple levels and hidden compartments. Finally, they reached the basement. Lincoln's heart pounded as he descended the stairs, his weapon trained on the door at the bottom. He motioned for Riley to cover him as he kicked it open. Inside, they found another hidden room. This one was filled with crates, documents, and surveillance equipment. But what caught Lincoln's attention was the group of children huddled in the corner, their faces pale and frightened. You're safe now, Lincoln said, lowering his weapon and stepping toward them. We're here to help. One of the children, a girl who looked about Amara's age, clung to his arm, tears streaming down her face. Are they gone? She asked, her voice trembling. They're gone, Lincoln assured her. They'll never hurt you again. Upstairs, Ridley and his team apprehended Hensley, who was trying to flee through a back entrance. He was tackled to the ground and cuffed, his face twisted in anger as officers hauled him to his feet. "You don't know what you've done," Hensley sneered as Ridley stared him down. "This won't stop anything." "We'll see about that," Ridley replied coldly. "Your operation is done." Back at the precinct, Lincoln sat with Amara and Micah, telling them the news. "We got him," he said. "The man in charge. And we rescued more kids." Amara's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really," Lincoln said with a nod. "You helped us save them, Amara. You and Micah are the reason we could do this." For the first time, Amara smiled, a real, genuine smile. And in that moment, Lincoln felt a glimmer of hope for the future. They had won a battle, and though the fight wasn't over, this victory was one worth celebrating. The courtroom was packed with reporters, families, and advocates as Victor Hensley sat at the defendant's table, his hands cuffed in front of him. The walls of the room seemed to vibrate with the tension that filled the air. It had been months since his arrest, and now the culmination of weeks of trial had arrived. Every piece of evidence, every testimony from the children, every connection unearthed in the trafficking network pointed squarely at Hensley as the mastermind. Detective Mark Ridley sat in the gallery, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His eyes stayed fixed on Hensley, watching the man's every move. Next to Ridley sat Lincoln Jace and Riley Maddox, both equally invested in seeing justice delivered. The network they had uncovered was massive, but this trial represented the first, and most significant, domino to fall. The prosecution was relentless in their closing argument. The lead attorney pointed to a large board filled with photos and evidence. "This man," she said, gesturing to Hensley, "orchestrated a criminal enterprise that destroyed the lives of countless children. He profited from their pain, using them as commodities to be bought, sold, and discarded. But thanks to the bravery of a single child who spoke up, and the tireless work of law enforcement, we've put an end to his reign of terror." Lincoln couldn't help but think of Amara as the attorney spoke. She had been that single child who had whispered the truth that started it all. Her courage had saved lives, and Lincoln felt a surge of pride knowing how far they had come because of her. When the jury returned with their verdict, the room fell into a heavy silence. The foreperson stood, clearing her throat as she read the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Victor Hensley, guilty on all counts." The room erupted into murmurs, and a wave of relief washed over Lincoln. Ridley allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction. Riley let out a quiet breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The judge struck his gavel, restoring order. "Victor Hensley, you have been found guilty of heinous crimes against humanity. This court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Hensley's expression remained stoic, but his eyes darkened as officers led him out of the courtroom. He passed Lincoln and the others, who stood silently as he was escorted away. Later that evening, Lincoln visited the safe house where Amara and Micah were staying. The children had been relocated to a more permanent foster home with a family that specialized in helping survivors of trauma. Lincoln had grown close to the siblings over the months, and he often stopped by to check on them. When he arrived, Amara was outside, sitting on the porch swing with Micah. She looked up as he approached, a bright smile lighting up her face. "Officer Lincoln," she called, jumping off the swing and running toward him. Lincoln crouched down, opening his arms to hug her. "Hey, Amara," he said warmly. "How are you doing?" "Good," she said, stepping back to grab Micah's hand. "We're doing good." Micah nodded shyly, holding up a drawing he had made. It was a picture of the two of them holding hands with Lincoln, all of them smiling. "This is for you," he said quietly. Lincoln took the drawing, his throat tightening with emotion. "Thank you, Micah. This is amazing. I'm going to keep it forever." Amara tugged on his sleeve. "Is it true? That the bad man won't hurt anyone again?" Lincoln nodded. It's true. He's in prison, and he's never getting out. You made that happen, Amara. You were brave enough to speak up, and because of you, a lot of kids are safe now. Amara beamed, her smile wide and full of pride. I just wanted to help, she said softly. You did more than help, Lincoln said. You changed everything. As the sun began to set, Lincoln sat with Amara and Micah on the porch, watching as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. The peace of the moment was a stark contrast to the chaos that had brought them together. For the first time in months, Lincoln felt a sense of closure. Ridley had been right, this was just the beginning. The operation had been massive, and while Hensley's arrest and conviction were a victory, there were still others out there. But for now, Lincoln chose to focus on the small victories. Amara and Micah were safe, and the children rescued from the warehouse and motel were beginning to heal. As he left the safe house that evening, Lincoln glanced back at Amara and Micah, who were waving goodbye from the porch. Their laughter echoed in the crisp night air, a sound that filled him with hope. Weeks later, a ceremony was held at City Hall to honor the officers and individuals involved in dismantling the trafficking network. Amara was invited as a special guest, along with her foster family. She stood nervously at the podium, holding Lincoln's hand as she looked out at the crowd. I was scared, she began, her voice trembling slightly. But I knew I had to tell someone. Officer Lincoln listened to me, and because of him, my brother and I are safe. And so are all those other kids. The crowd erupted into applause, and Lincoln felt tears sting his eyes. He squeezed Amara's hand gently, his heart swelling with pride. As they stepped off the stage, Amara looked up at him. Do you think the kids we saved will be okay? I do, Lincoln said, his voice steady. Because they're strong. Just like you. Amara smiled, and in that moment, Lincoln knew that no matter how much darkness he had seen in this case, the light of Amara's courage would always shine brighter. It was a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable evil, hope and bravery could prevail. The ending of this story serves as a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the ripple effect of courage. Amara's decision to whisper the truth despite her fear demonstrates how even the smallest voice can spark monumental change. Her bravery not only saved her brother and herself but also dismantled a dangerous network, bringing hope to countless children who might have otherwise been forgotten. Officer Lincoln Jace's unwavering determination to protect and uplift Amara and Micah highlights the best of humanity, compassion paired with action. His role in ensuring justice while nurturing trust with the children showcases how law enforcement can be a source of healing and safety when approached with empathy. The bittersweet tone of the ending, where victories are celebrated but scars remain, is a reminder of the complexity of healing. The story doesn't shy away from the harsh realities of trauma but leaves us with hope that, through love, resilience, and community, even the deepest wounds can begin to mend. This conclusion also reinforces the importance of listening and acting. A single whisper, heard by the right person, can become a catalyst for justice and change. It's a story of redemption, justice, and the unyielding fight for a better future, a narrative that reminds us that even in the darkest of moments, light can prevail.